The main occasion of the event was to talk about the first full English translation of Memoirs of a Revolutionary. That Richard might talk some about the pockmarked history of the book, but thanks to NYRB for coming out, and books will be for sale afterwards. And in general, thanks to everyone for being here to celebrate this book and to talk about the legacy of Serge and of the Russian Revolution and of more generally radical politics today. Richard is a Marxist scholar, long active in human rights, anti-war, anti-nuclear, environmental and labor struggles in the US, Latin America, France, and Russia. Richard is best known for his studies and translations of the Franco-Russian novelist and revolutionary Victor Serge. He also writes regularly about politics, international class struggles, and revolutionary theory. He's the co-founder of the Praxis Research and Education Center in Moscow. He's based in Montpellier, France, where he directs the International Victor Serge Foundation. And Chris, you wanted to say you were going to give a little introduction to Platypus briefly.
Oh yeah, well, we kind of went over it, but as we said, Platypus was founded in 2006, mainly with disenchantment with the way the anti-war movement was going, and so it just started as a reading group, but it kind of formed into a wider organization that spread through various chapters across the globe now, most notably Germany, United States, and England are where our largest base. So the activities that we do is we hold public fora like this. We also have a monthly newsletter called the Platypus Review, where a lot of the transcripts and other engagements that we have with figures on and of the left are published there. We're largely student-based, but if anyone's interested in submitting to the Platypus Review, which is a free publication, you're welcome to do so. The information is on the back. And if you want some news announcements about upcoming events here in New York, just let one of us know. We'll take down your email and or phone number, and we will continue that way. But I'll just keep it at that because we already kind of briefly had a quick chat.
So I think how we're going to do today is Richard's going to give a short presentation,
Sure.
and then he and I will maybe chat a little bit, and then we'll open it up. It's kind of a nice intimate setting in a seminar room, so we'll have us a little seminar about this history and try to think through, Platypus says it hosts the conversation. We try to have critical conversations about the relevance of left-wing ideas, past and present. So that's what we hope to do this evening. Thanks for coming.
Good. Well, I think the first thing you might want to know about Serge's Memoirs of a Revolutionary, which you hold up the book, is that is not a title that Serge chose. And I think he would roll over in his grave if he had a grave. Something like, because, of course, it is a well-known title of Peter Kropotkin, the great anarchist, and then also Vera Figner. And Vera Figner was one of the Russian founders of the neurotic movement and very active in the role in the assassination of the Tsar, along with Viktor's remote ancestor Kibalchich, because Kibalchich was Serge's family name. He translated it under her stern supervision in Leningrad in the early 30s. So, I mean, these are towering figures, and Victor Serge was a very, very modest man. So he would not have been happy with the title that was slapped on this book by a French publisher, since it was the obvious, easy choice. A few years after Serge died, when the manuscript finally turned up. What I'd like to start is by just reading one page from Serge's, that's not the book I'm thinking of, all right. Serge wrote notebooks, the way that authors did in those days. They were kind of sketches for future pieces or just a diary, but not just a sloppy one. They were well composed. And some of them were published before the war or after the war by Sartre. But last year, a whole cache of them, a trove of them, as they now say, turned up in Mexico in the archive of his widow, who for some reason or other had suppressed them. In any case, suddenly we have new Serge that has surged. And we have here his diary entry for, for February 28th, 1943. So that's exactly how many years ago?
70.
70, yes. So, and he begins this diary entry, Janine's birthday. Now, Janine was his daughter, who was born under terrible circumstances in the middle of the Stalinist persecution in 1936, and whom Serge didn't see because he was deported out in Central Asia until they were released from Russia, until Stalin permitted them to leave. So we literally met her as they were going for the train. I mention this because Serge was one of the rare revolutionaries who was a hands-on parent, who raised his son, Vladi, and then his daughter, his daughter, Janine, because his wife, Lyuba, went completely insane, was totally schizophrenic as in the early 30s as a result of the Stalinist persecutions, and I assume as a result of growing up in the era of pogroms in Russia. So not only was he was this hands-on father, and I was very close friends with his son, and in fact saw his daughter just before she died a few years ago in Mexico. So now, here's what he writes in his notebook. Finished souvenir, which I would probably entitle Souvenirs of Vanished Worlds for the French edition. What is left of these worlds which I have known, where I have struggled? France, before the First World War, the victory. Spain, where the revolutionary fermenting was rising so powerfully. The Europe of Birth of Our Power, which was one of his early novels, with a strong anarchist background to it, about a syndicalist uprising in Spain in 1917. Russia during the great epic years, the Europe of boundless hopes, Germany and Austria at indecisive crossroads, the Russian Thermidor, and by that you understand the transformation into a dictatorship, the West of popular fronts. None of these worlds will ever be reborn. We are being launched at top speed towards something new, through disasters, through unforeseeable rebirths, or toward long dusks, which at times will resemble rebirths. How many dead left behind me on all those paths? 3 or 4 generations of comrades. So he's basically talking about the pre-World War I French anarchism, syndicalism of the Spanish variety, which resurfaced in the 30s and was really mainspring of the Spanish Revolution that took place after Franco's coup d'etat. And then the Russian Revolution, with the struggles of the Civil War, and then the struggles of all the oppositions that Serge was part of, the workers' opposition and later the left and united opposition, fighting the bureaucracy, fighting tyranny, and ultimately succumbing and being sent to the Gulag, and then assassinated in these horrible show trials where they were made to confess before, disgrace themselves before being executed. The book is finished. I'm at an impasse. Is it publishable? It is dense, a difficult read, for I wanted to make of it a precise and thought-out testimony, not the emotional adventure of me, capital M, which is what it would have taken to write a bestseller. I'll use Serge's, and when he uses English, I'll put his accent on it. But that's not its real defect. It accuses the Stalinist regime piteously, objectively, even more than my novel, The Case of Comrade Tulayev, deemed, quote, unpublishable at this time in New York, by virtue of an unwritten law, as one publisher put it, which forbids criticizing Russian despotism, our ally, in quotes and in English. Thus, the more a book is intense, rich, irrefutable, and the better it pokes its finger in the wound from which the universe is suffering, the less chance it has of being published. This will probably change, and perhaps soon. But how to live counting on this soon, which could contain an epic, when every semester carries its weight of rent and daily bread. So not only was he turned down in New York, he was turned down in London, where no one less than George Orwell had his manuscript and was trying to get it published. And of course, in the war days and the Popular Front days, anything that criticized Uncle Joe Stalin was, considered anathema. And the question of bread plagued him his whole life. His younger brother, as you may know, died basically of undernourishment. He got a disease but was unable to fight it, Serge was hungry almost all his life. He was in jail for 5 years, where they stole everything that was nourishing out of the food by corruption and so on. And starved during the Civil War in Russia, where an extra piece of herring that he would get from militiamen after he gave them a course in revolutionary politics, they'd walk him home so that no one would knock him out for his herring on the way back from these classes. So, and in Mexico, he was denied the right to publish anything. Once the Stalinists got wind that he was there, they controlled all the press, they controlled the newspapers, the magazines, the publishing houses, and one publishing house did publish him. It was simply bought by the Russian embassy, by somebody behind the scenes. So he says, at times a crushing feeling of an impasse closed at both ends. It is no longer an impasse, it's a vast prison yard. And he certainly knew enough about prison yards, having spent more than 10 of his meager 57 years behind bars. No way to get an article into an American magazine, same reason, and my name scares them. 2 great unpublishable books, crying out with truth. No possibility of finding work here. Now, actually, in the years after he wrote this, he wrote another great unpublishable book, and wrote in another diary entry how difficult it is to write for the desk drawer when you're past 50 and have no idea what the future will bring. So these 3 books, which have been brought out by New York Review of Books, are the Memoirs, The Case of Comrade Tulayev, and now the most recent, which was unpublished in France even till the 1970s, the Unforgiving Years, the harshest of his novels, the most difficult, and in many ways the most deep. So he talks about how he would try to tone it all down and maybe get it through, although he's afraid that his name would be an obstacle to publication. And in fact, he did write another novel, which did get published in French in Canada during the war. But it's a novel where he did pull his punches. It's a conventional novel, a very good one, in the vein of Howard Fast or such, that talks about the beginnings of the fall of France and the beginnings of the French resistance. But it doesn't go too, it pulls its punches. It doesn't name names. And he concludes, if I were younger, more muscular force, I would wait it out, working at any job that brings in the bacon. But I have nothing left in some but brain. A brain which nobody needs at this moment, and which many would prefer to see pierced by a small, definitive bullet. And of course, at just about this time, they did take a shot at him. He attempted to set up a meeting, a memorial for the Italian-American anarchist Carlo Tresca, who was shot down exactly 70 years ago, a few blocks from here in Greenwich Village. Shot down either by the Stalinists, the Mussolinis or the Mafia, because he was on all their cases. And a woman named Rosemary, what's her last name, has written a wonderful book.
All the right enemies.
Exactly, All the Right Enemies. And if the title weren't taken, we could use that for the biography of Serge. He certainly had.
It was Fifth Avenue and 18th or 16th that he was
Right,
on.
right around the corner from here. So, now, let's get to the story of this translation. The book finally appeared under a made-up title in France in the 40s. Some people paid attention to it. And in the early 60s, when the New Left was beginning to come forth, the New Left meaning those people who, after the Khrushchev crushed the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, the Hungarian Revolution of Workers' Councils, that is to say, Soviets, came out of the Communist Party or the parties that sympathized and started the New Left. And one of the founders of the New Left was Peter Sedgwick, who did this translation painstakingly with his wonderful knowledge of French and his encyclopedic knowledge of the left. And working, he had a job as a tutor in a prison and raising kids. He managed to do this in his spare time for Oxford Press. He had graduated as a scholarship student from Oxford. And then, in '63, they told him that they wouldn't print it unless he cut it, because the book was too long, they felt. And this book that Serge describes here is so dense that it's clear that he's afraid that no one will understand it. All of these forgotten words, that was the original title, Memories of Disappeared Worlds, that they were forgotten, which is one of the reasons that my contribution to that volume was a glossary, which is thick like this, of all the names. Because if you try to read this book with hundreds of Russian names, especially since the Russians have 3 or 4 names, you'd never get through it. The footnotes are no good, because the same person is going to come back 100 pages later, and you won't remember who he was when he was first introduced. So, as many of you know, I'm working on a critical biography of Serge, which will be published in a year or so. I'm collaborating with my friend Rich here on the finishing touches. And the biography is necessary because the title, Memoirs of a Revolutionary, doesn't really talk about Serge. We never know if he was ever married, although he was 3 times. Or the only reason we know about his son is that he's said something funny on a train. And all of it, he was very discreet about his personal life. And clearly what he wanted to do was describe the atmosphere of these revolutionary movements and the feeling of the people. Of course, what he was best at is describing atmosphere and describing individuals. He believed, like many writers, that you could sort of read in someone's face and their way of holding themselves and so on, something about them. And so he's presented unforgettable vignettes of everyone from Lenin to Trotsky to the most obscure fighters in the ranks of the anarchists and so on. So let me see now. This translation that Peter came out with was the standard English translation. It was cut by, we think, about 1/8. And Peter made at least 200 separate cuts because he didn't want to break the continuity. So he literally excised sentences and paragraphs here and there. And the book was published and stood as a standard edition until this year. I had been, or last year, I had been trying to get a publisher to put it back together again. And finally, the New York Review of Books agreed to do this. And I have a friend in England, George Paisis, who was a Greek socialist and a member of the British Socialist Workers' Party, and a specialist on Marcel Martinet, who was a proletarian poet in France and a mentor of Victor Serge. And so what he did is he went through the thing page by page, found the cuts, translated them from French into English, and we put this whole book together. So it's labor of love because nobody ever got rich translating Serge any more than Serge ever got rich from his books. And these are all labors of love done by people who are generally heavy-duty militants who are also lovers of literature. And most recently now, Al Richardson, who alas passed away a few years ago, did a complete translation of Serge's writings on literature and art. It's a big, thick volume like that, which you can get from Butler Publishers in England. And no such thing has ever been published in France. In fact, we've done very well by Serge. Serge is completely neglected in the university world, entirely in France. In the US, we've had some. In Britain, there have been 3 theses on Serge. Mine, Bill Marshall's The Uses of Dissent, a wonderful book at Oxford, and Susan Weissman, who's just revised her book, which was basically a study of Serge's analysis of Stalinism, which she has now recycled as a biography, but I understand added things, so we'll see about that when it comes out. But there was never, although Serge's books are often ordered for courses, the novels particularly, but also the memoirs of anybody that was writing about Russia in the revolution. He's just quoted by all of the specialists, but no one has ever, really written about him in a university context. And he has fallen out of all of the departments of literature, being neither French nor really Russian, and by birth, but not nationality, Belgian, and buried, and being in a pauper's grave in Mexico, where his friends chipped in for a funeral, the cheapest one they could find, only to discover that they couldn't bury him because he never had a nationality. He was born a stateless exile. The only nationality he ever had was Soviet between 1919 and 36, when Stalin stripped him of Soviet nationality. So they finally buried him as a Spanish Republican. Of course, the Spanish Republic had been put down in blood a few years before, so there was no one there to object to that nationality, which his son says would have probably pleased him very much. And his son immortalized him with the shoe with a hole in it, which is what he found when he went to the morgue, where the police had put a band over his mouth. He said, well, the law finally succeeded in closing his mouth. But in fact, they did that when his rigor mortis was setting in, so that they wouldn't have to bury him, like this, which is how people look when they die. So that's a story of the translation, and I'd just like to end with a little quote from Francois Maspero. He's a French novelist, and in the 60s was a publisher. That was the name of his publishing house, Maspero, and he was the French publisher who broke again with the Stalinist tradition, published all the third world stuff, from Che Guevara on up and down, all the Latin American stuff, and Victor Serge. It was he who started the Serge revival. And recently he wrote when Serge's poetry was reissued in France. I want to quote him directly because it's such a cute quote. I'll just quote it from memory. He says, everywhere in the world there is an invisible international of people who have read Serge's works and know a lot about him. And this is true. I've had people who, when they find out who I am, tell me things about Serge that I didn't know. And Adam Huthchild, whom I think you do know because he's a very famous American writer, most recently Stalin's Ghost, and Leopold, you know, he wrote the book about the Congo. Oh, and actually his most recent book is about the anti-World War I movement in Britain. Anyway, he was the founder of Mother Jones. He's just a wonderful radical writer. And he talks in his preface here about going to some place in Latin America and people introducing a party of intellectuals and leftists. And someone mentions Victor Serge, and suddenly all of these people are friends, this Invisible International. So I'm inviting you to join the Invisible International of Serge Readers. You can also, be happy for you to join the Victor Serge Reading Group, which meets at the Brecht Forum every Monday at 5:30, from 5:30 to 7:30, and we're reading through all of Serge's works from beginning to end. So we're up to 1919 this semester. We'll get through 1919 and we're up to 21 by the middle of June, and then reconvene in September with the book stuff that basically Serge wrote after his Soviet experience, but which obviously is going to focus on it. So remember that. And in fact, I think that I would be very happy to see some kind of synergy between Platypus and the Brecht Forum, since both are voluntary organizations that are extremely committed, yet extremely eclectic and not tied to orthodoxies, and dedicated to serious thinking, critical thinking. And there you'll find not too many students, but a lot of working people of all ages and all backgrounds. So it's a good mix. The seminar that I've been sort of chairing there, I suppose, I rarely get a word in edgewise. Because they know so much. There are some that are anarchists or ex-Trotskyists or one thing or another. Believe me, they're heavy duty and we have good times. Now, one last thing I wanted to say, which is that I wrote a postface to the New York Review of Books volume, which was accidentally left out. There was enough extra material that I stuffed in already. It may not have been such an accident. As Freud said, accidents never happen. In any case, they put it online, so you can read it, and it's also in the coming issue of New Politics magazine, for which I've been writing for, I don't know, 50 years, and sometimes about Serge. What it was, the title of it is Victor Serge's Political Testament, because Serge has been criticized from the right, from the left, and from among the anarchists as well. Because he was such an independent cuss, his original pen name as a teenage anarchist was Maverick, okay? Or Bronco. I think Maverick is a better translation. Le Rétif in French, and it applies to an unbreakable horse. That's what it means in farm French. He was much maligned when he went over to Russia and decided that he would join with the Reds against the Whites, and soon started working for the Communist International, and eventually joined the party, along with people like Bill Haywood from the Wobblies, and Bill Chaloff, who was another Russo-U.S. anarchist, who headed the defense of Petersburg during the Civil War, and dozens of other anarchists went over to the side of the Soviets. Now, Serge did it, knowing that they were authoritarians, knowing that he had a lot of big differences with them, and that they were excessive for statist and violent solutions. But there was nothing else between them and the whites. And if you criticize them, he felt the only way you'd ever be listened to is to criticize from within. And so that was the tactic that he adopted throughout the 10 years that he was in Russia, until, of course, he was expelled from the party and then arrested and then interrogated and maybe tortured a little bit and ultimately sent into administrative exile way out in Central Asia. But this doesn't stop the anarchists from considering him a Bolshevik and, no goodnik from that. On the other hand, he was, of course, along with Trotsky in the left opposition. In fact, he remained in the left opposition through 36 and was the only survivor of the Russian left opposition persecuted by Stalin to escape, along with Silica, who was a Yugoslav oppositionist, Anton Silica, later kind of leaning over to the right, nationalist right. But so when Serge came out, he and Trotsky bonded immediately. Trotsky got him to translate his books and so on, and wanted him to join the Fourth International. And Serge was queasy because he didn't believe he could form an international until you had parties in other countries, and that Trotsky would be much better to, become the figurehead of a larger group of humanist socialists who criticized what was happening in Russia. But Trotsky was intolerant of that. And when the issues of Kronstadt, the Bolshevik crushing of the revolt of Soviet sailors in 1921, and the founding of the CK, the Special Commission for Repression, which happened early on in 1918, when Trotsky raised these issues, Serge allowed himself to discuss with him in the party little papers, and Trotsky called him an anti-Marxist and a dilettante and a sycophant and a moralist, and pretty much excoriated him. And these epithets have stuck, so that Trotskyists have never really been very warm to Serge, and even the post-Trotskyists still pick at him. So, on the one hand, there was a book published last year in France by an anarchist called Serge, the Double Man, which shows on its cover Serge, half of his, I don't want to try to describe the cover, but its thesis is Serge was a liar, everything that he wrote was a liar, and because he stopped, because in fact, during part of the time that he was in Russia, he wrote propaganda for the revolution and didn't mention some of the terrible things that they were doing. Although he did say at the end of these pieces, but we must clearly keep in mind anarchists' views, and that when the Civil War is over, this has got to stop and stuff like that. But in any case, he's been sniped at from the right and from the left. And most recently, in the New York Review of Books, of all places, where the review of my translation of Unforgiving Years dredged up all of these old, insults. It didn't really give them credence, but didn't answer them either. So I felt that it was important to publish in an appendix the last writing that we have from Serge, which is his political testimony, in which he says that yes, the Bolsheviks made a lot of mistakes, but then if you look at history, what has liberalism given us? Talking about World War I and World War II. What has conservatism given us? Not Hitler, not Franco, not Salazar, not Mussolini. So if we were to start, doing a balance sheet for all of the ideologies, we'd have our work cut out for us, and it's not over yet. So he writes this piece in which he said the Bolsheviks made one big mistake. They lost, because they made the revolution as the opening gun in a world revolution, in a backward, beleaguered, undeveloped country where everybody knew from Marx on up you couldn't make a socialist revolution. But they thought in the middle of World War I, with the slaughter in the trenches, and by the way, you know, a few days of World War I killed more people than the Bolsheviks killed in Cheka, that you had to be with the Bolsheviks. And that if the revolution had come in Germany as it was expected, and of course it did come in Hungary and some other countries, but the United States and 14 other big capitalist powers, including Japan, attacked the Soviet Union, or it wasn't even called the Soviet Union, attacked the Russian Republic, the first republic that was ever created in Russia after the Tsar, from every side, and gave huge amounts of money and supplies to bloodthirsty contra armies of white guards, of white generals, who would have won because the peasants went over to their side until they remembered what the white officers were like, who whipped them and starved them and wanted to take back the land that Lenin had given to the peasants. So they deserted back to the Bolsheviks, and that's Serge's version, one of Serge's version of how the Civil War was done. But his point is that if the Bolshevik, if the counter-revolution had not been able to crush the Soviets when they were still vital and still democratic, we would have been saved Nazism. We would have been saved World War II. So that's his testament. And the other last thing, you know, we're talking about like within weeks of his death, is he wrote a letter to Masses magazine, a small publication that published him very far left in France, saying they had published an anti-communist piece by an American. And he said, for crying out loud, you know, if we criticize Stalinism, let it be from a socialist point of view, from the point of view of the working class. In France, the workers are in the Communist Party, and we have to talk to them honestly and directly. What is this business of bringing, you know, this Cold War stuff over from America? Well, that hasn't stopped, for example, Alan Wald, who was a very famous literary critic in the United States and a big post-Trotskyist Trotskyist, from saying that Serge would today be on the right. He would have joined the neocons. What is his basis for this charge? Well, very simple. Serge wrote a few articles in English that were published by the Partisan Review and the New Leader. He was starving in Mexico, and they paid. And the people who published that and the writers for the Partisan Review, eventually, 30 years later, and 40 years after Serge's death, ended up on the neocon right. So this is a case of guilt by association.
Some of them, not even Dwight McDonald or others, did not ever go to the right. Right.
No, McDonald he became somewhat apolitical until '68. I was friends with him when he came up and cheered us at Columbia when we took over the school. But, no. Dwight and Serge were very close. But
Dwight McDonald help him get out?
What?
Doesn't Dwight McDonald help him?
Dwight McDonald and Nancy, his wife, were principally responsible, along with some Spanish from the poor, you know, for saving Serge. And of course, Marion Fry, that marvelous American hero, who set up the American Rescue Committee in Marseille and helped some of the people get out, despite the fact that the U.S. had closed all the doors to refugees and insisted that the Latin Americans do so, to the Jews and to the radicals. They didn't want any of them on this continent. So anyway, this is like not only guilt by association, the man doesn't know French. So he's writing an article on Serge on the basis of a few dozen pieces that he wrote for American publications, mostly reportorial, when 99% of Serge's writings are in the French language. So, you know, this is the level at which, but what they do is they repeat the Trotsky's accusations against Serge that were provoked by National Provocateur, the famous Etienne, because Trotsky didn't read what Serge wrote. He attacked Serge for what Etienne told him Serge wrote, attacking Marxism. Serge in the Partisan Review defended Marxism. And you can read that article, which is a brilliant, if you ever want to read an honest defense of Marxism, go to the Partisan Review and read Marxism in Our Time by Victor Serge. He was invited to participate in a Partisan Review seminar on the crisis of Marxism. Of course, Marxism has its crisis every generation, but somehow they keep burying it and it keeps coming up, like since 2008. So he contributed a very positive piece about saying that thought cannot descend below what Marx brought out, and that you shouldn't confuse real Marxism with the quote-unquote Marxism of the bloody gunmen of Moscow. That's an exact quote. But Trotsky was led to believe that he was attacking Marxism, and so he called him a sycophant and a dilettante, and said that Sergism, as if there was such a thing, is a bridge from communism to the right. So I felt it was important to defend these things, to defend his honor, and so I did. And you can check that article out. It's online at New York Review of Books. So I think I probably talked longer than I should have.
No, you're fine. Can I ask one quick question and then have a
10
general discussion?
long questions.
So you mentioned in the Serge's quote about himself that he had a brain nobody needed, and I'm curious if you think like that it's a brain we need in the present, or more broadly, like what the to some degree why we're here, and one of the things Platypus takes very seriously is whether this revolutionary tradition has any purchase on the present. And so I'm curious, what role you think Victor Serge has in making clear, or perhaps more confusing, the relationship of the past to the present.
Clearer and more confusing, because if it isn't, if we don't seize all the contradictions, what are we doing? Is that repeating a lot of stuff, and most of which didn't pan out as one hoped it would have. I think Serge is essential to this revival, and at the Left Forum this year, there will be 2 panels on Serge. The one I'm doing with Mitch and some other people from our study group, and one called The Resurgence of Serge, which I think is a nice pun. But clearly, every generation has rediscovered him. The first set of translations I did were in the wake of 1968, and there was a reason for that. And I think he was a much better guy than Albert Camus, who was reputedly the guru of the SDS and so on. Because Serge tells it really like it is, and he's not afraid to criticize both the anarchists and the socialists and the communists. And reading him is an education in revolutionary history. And he doesn't really have an axe to grind. Plus, he was there because of his talents as a publicist, as a translator. He was putting out his own anarchist sheet called The Rebel at the age of 16, I think, with his friends in Brussels. And as soon as he got to Russia, even though he was an anarchist, they put him and another ex-anarchist in charge of the Comintern, the Communist International's press service, because no one else knew how to set up a press shop with Roman characters, and to set up, the distribution of articles to be sent out to France and Germany and Spain and all these places, trying to make the message of the Russians and the Soviets known, because they were, of course, calumny was the biggest, the slanders against the Russians, that Lenin was his German agent and all of that stuff was one of the big weapons in that Civil War. I see a hand down here.
Quick technical question. What year would that be that he was running that Comintern?
Starting in March of 1919. The first Comintern Congress took place in Moscow in 1919, in January. But it was really, they pulled together whoever happened to be there from foreign countries that had connections with parties there, and they kind of just put it together. The second Comintern conference is the first one where delegates managed to get through the blockade. And Serge was very active in that. You can see he was the translator.
So why don't we open it up for more general, I mean, I had more questions, but they'll come up. I think we should open it up for a general discussion. Thank you, Richard. Well,
How much of the anarchism, obviously already by Serge's moment, anarchism was a quite diverse phenomenon, having a number of different tendencies and philosophies involved within it. Within Marxism, of course, there were various splits, some of them serious, revisionism, later on Kautskyism, Bolshevism, etc. How much today how much do anarchism and Marxism today really carry any of that, of what existed then? Because if anything, it's become more fractious on either side. And anarchism, though it was very prominent in '36 with the Spanish Revolution, after that point, like the mainstream of the left seemed to gravitate more towards communism, or various forms of communism being Stalinism, or various forms of Trotskyism.
Don't forget social democracy,
And social democracy in Europe, yes. So I guess my question is, to what extent does the anarchism and Marxism that Victor Serge was familiar with, that he talked about, that he struggled to negotiate throughout his life, practically, really map onto the kind of fraught relationship between anarchism and Marxism today, seeing as both one might fairly call the anarchism of today a sort of neo-anarchism, and even kind of like David Graeber, like the new Marxists, or the new anarchists, and then Saul Newman, post-anarchism, or with Laclau and Mouffe, the kind of post-Marxism. So, I guess, what lessons can we learn given the difference between, anarchism and Marxism then versus today?
Well, Serge wrote a little piece, again, just before he died, a little manuscript, which would be the last one in our anthology, on anarchism. And he goes through almost exactly like you just did, because, and he wrote a little book on anarchist theory as well in the 30s. And what he says is, all right, you've got the classic anarchist teachers. You've got Proudhon, and then you've got Kropotkin, Élisée Reclus, and so on, who basically laid down the ideas of anarchist communism. And then you had on the far end anarcho-individualism, based on Stirner, and to a certain extent on Nietzsche. And Serge gets caught up in this French anarcho-individualist movement, which was particularly took the form of bomb throwing and individual expropriation and so on, and led to a terrible tragedy in France, where all of his friends, his gang, his group from his teen years, ended up on the guillotine or fighting it out with the police and dying. Plus all their friends who went in by solidarity to save them. So that kind of came to an end. It was a total defeat. And then when the war broke out, I'm talking about August 1914, World War I, one remembers that the Social Democrats capitulated, and that having passed, the Socialist International passed, I don't know how many resolutions at its international conferences saying that in the case of war, the workers would not fight against each other and so on. but in fact they all voted to rearm their governments and to participate in the war effort, both in France and in Germany. And then there were the anarcho-syndicalists, who, pretty much alone in France, opposed the war and went over to the movement that Lenin started, and his friends in Zimmerwald and Kienthal. And it was to those people that Serge addressed himself when he was in Russia. And it was the syndicalist publications that he sent his articles to, or that were willing to publish them. Because by that time, Jean Grave and Faure, who were the big pre-war anarchist popes, if you will, had compromised themselves with French patriotism, and then and Kropotkin as well.
Supported Tsarism.
No, he didn't support Tsarism.
He supported the war effort.
He supported the war effort. Because they all considered the German imperialism was somehow more horrible than French and British imperialism. Well, tell that to an Indian, or an African, or an American Indian for that matter. So, now, of those traditions, I don't see too much trace of Kropotkin and of Bakunin and of the anarchist classics that I love to read and which I consider important in today's anarchists. But maybe I'm wrong. In any case, Serge felt that anarchism, with its stress on freedom and the freedom of the individual, and on criticism and on anti-authoritarianism and on federation and so on, was a very important moral corrective to Marxism and communism, which had a tendency to be sectarian and state-oriented. And so that, and he also said that in this last document, which I'm quoting from memory, that from really the very beginning, the Bolsheviks, just like the Kautskyists, Mitch found that out recently, their one thing in taking power was that they weren't going to tolerate the anarchists. So even though the anarchists played a pretty important role in the early phases of the Russian Revolution, and of course the Makhnevist movement in Ukraine of partisans that were strong, fought the whites and defeated them, and then were stabbed in the back by the Reds, who had made a pact with them. So Serge felt that intolerance on the part of the Marxists and so on was terrible. So I think what we need to do is move away from the Marxist intolerance. For example, the chair of this panel at the Left Forum, called Resurgent Serge, is a man named Hillel Tickton, who is one of the most stridently angry sectarians who excoriates anything to do with anarchism. If you say the word anarchism, it makes him foam at the mouth.
We had him on a panel in London.
What?
We had him on a panel in London with David Graeber.
Oh, that's right. He's in the paper.
Yeah, with David Graeber and Saul Newman, two anarchists.
Oh my gosh! Well, did he bite them?
No, there was a kind of ex-Marxist there too. So there were a lot of different angles to James Witthuizen have spiked online. So kind of like more right-wing ex-Marxist.
Because Claudio Albertani, who's also on that panel, and who was the one who rediscovered these carnet, the notebooks of Serge, and published them in French, he's very sympathetic towards anarchism, so he'll talk, I think, quite eloquently about it if he chooses to.
Can you follow up?
Yes,
I just want to
yes, please.
Something that Richard said. It's actually answer the question you asked earlier. That in a piece in the early 20s, addressed to anarchists or about anarchists in the revolution. And at this point, he was already a supporter of the Bolsheviks, but he said that Marxism lacks an ethics, a personal ethics, and a respect for the individual, and that's what anarchists could bring to the Russian Revolution. And another interesting one was that anarchists could also prevent moral backsliding. You know, that Marxists, the Bolsheviks had a tendency towards, they were not all that progressive on moral questions. You know, Stalin criminalized homosexuality because it was a bourgeois fault. And so he thought also that anarchists could save, you know, that once the revolution had won, once the Civil War had been won, that the anarchists could prevent Marxism from like becoming like a moral, you know, the country from being like a moral marshland, and that they could bring a progressive morality to the Soviet Union.
But, I mean, the recriminalizing homosexuality only happened in like 29, right?
It was later on, but
Yeah, so I mean, the Marxism that he would have been addressing in the early 20s, decriminalized it and made abortion much easier.
But he already sensed at the time that, you know, that, I mean, remember, this was still a country that if you read, you know, Conquered City, the anti-Semitic stuff in it, you know, people talking on the streets about killing the Jews, and you know, the Jews are finally going to get, you know, are going to get theirs. So he knew this stuff was really happening, that even in the midst of the revolution, there was still an ugly side to the Russian populace. So
I want to finish the question that you asked, okay? Because, and I'll talk from personal experience. As soon as Gorbachev and Glasnost came in, Serge's son, Platy, and I made a beeline for Russia, partly in the hope of recovering some of Serge's manuscripts, which had been seized by the secret police, but just to breathe the air of a new world that they had started to push back Stalinism. And we met some people there who knew about Victor Serge, and who had been deprived of any contact with Western Marxism, anarchism, critical thought, and so on. And so we created a library called the Victor Serge Library, and I collected 5,000 different books, which we shipped over in a container, and it was a wonderful, mad adventure, but they actually got there. And we've been, since 1997, having the Victor Serge Library in Moscow, and now another one in Kiev, with thousands of books where you could learn about feminism and the trade union movement and all the different, you know, gay liberation and everything. All of this completely banned in Russia, you know, up until 1989 or 90. And we hold regular meetings. In fact, our first meeting, the opening meeting, was the first critical discussion of the Spanish Civil War and of Stalin's role in it that was ever held in Russia. And so we published a lot of books, Serge books, but also books like The Hidden Revolution about the Magnanist movement by Volin, and critical Marxist books, and all kinds of books. And we hold conferences and meetings. Now, at these conferences, our group, which we call Praxis, has around it whatever is left of anarchists and critical Marxists and radical Democrats in Russia. And we come together and we've had wonderful, wild arguments lasting 3 days. We've had now 15 annual international conferences. But this has been a very creative process. We published in Russian, you know, the proceeds of our deliberations, and we've come to a number of conclusions where the Marxists have had to admit that the anarchists were damn right about a lot of things from the very beginning. And the anarchists have come down from their absolute hostility to anything to do with Marxism, because we've exposed them to another side of Marx, whose writings against the state and against state socialism, whose writings about humanism, and so on, were pretty much unknown, and certainly not stressed either by the Social Democrats. Kautsky was as rigid more rigid than Lenin on these subjects. In fact, it's been argued, notably by Raya Dunayevskaya, that everything in Lenin's What Is to Be Done is just a translation in Russia of Kautsky's idea of the party. Except taking it one step further, since they were illegal, obviously they had to have professional revolutionaries that had to be supported by the party in the underground. But it's the same idea. So I think that Marxism and anarchism are correctives to each other. In any case, anarchism has no political economy. It's not for nothing that Bakunin translated Das Kapital into Russian, and at the time wrote to Marx, "You are the master and I am your disciple."
Other people, questions, thoughts?
Okay. Having heard about Serge for quite a long time, I had a very different picture of him. I had pictured him as a man who, literally, I thought these novels were it. And now I'm realizing how polymath his approach was. Will there be a good analogy, not analogy, what's what I'm looking for? Anthology, that's it, very good. Of, that article he wrote for the Review of Books, some of his criticisms, some of his writings on art, perhaps, his final testament that he put me afterward.
Well, I suggest that anybody that wants to know Serge start with this wonderful new version of the Memoirs, where you can have the whole story, and where there are the appendixes and everything that you need to understand it. The novels stand very well on themselves, although I've written prefaces that try to put them into historical and political context, as well as talk about their artistic qualities. Many of Serge's works are now in print in English, probably more than in French right now, and will soon be out with this anthology of Serge's writings about anarchism that go from 1906 to his dying day.
Because there's already anthologies on writings from Germany. I think there's also a Chinese one.
Yes.
There's another one
On the internet.
Writings in Chinese?
Right,
No, on the Chinese Revolution.
There's a Ian Birchall did also on early days in Russia. It was one of those, published by Haymarket. That Anarchist Never Surrenders, which will be next year's book on his anarchist period. And also the writings on literature and art translated.
Yeah, Al Richardson was a big fat tome.
Oh, okay, so
Yes,
just go out and look. is what you're saying.
Yeah, actually, the internet is a good place to start. That's where he's been publishing. There's a site called Marxist Internet. What is it?
Archive.
Marxist.
Marxist.org.
M-I-A.
And for the Victor Serge, there's this many translations.
Wonderful.
Most, this might be.
Yes. And now on China, no, he didn't write in Chinese.
No.
But when he returned to Russia from a safe berth in Vienna, where he was a journalist, he went to Russia as Stalin was taking over, when everybody that had common sense was running in the other direction, to fight to see if Stalin could be stopped, which was
Foolish.
from a practical point of view, but he was consistent with this anarchist morality, if you want to call it anarchist, of double duty. Serge's apparent contradictions, his apparent vacillations that Trotsky accused him of, were all based on a very simple principle that he was first to formulate, which is that as revolutionaries we have a double duty. Number one, to defend the revolutionary movement against the attacks of the capitalists, the monarchists, the white guards, and the religious fanatics and so on. And on the other hand, to defend it against its own inner deformations, corruption, bureaucracy, authoritarianism, male chauvinism, you name it. It's all in it, and this is what was missing from SDS, for example. It was sexist as hell. I was one of the few, being an old Marxist and used to these struggles, to stand up, among the males in SDS, and I dare say many of the females that were leaders were pretty macho and didn't pose the question of women's equality. So this double duty is perhaps a more difficult duty than just, going out and demonstrating or fighting against U.S. imperialism. You have to fight against U.S. imperialism. It's the biggest and nastiest one. But it doesn't mean that French imperialism, Chinese imperialism, Brazilian imperialism against the forest and the landless peasants, and so on. So this double duty sense is what I think Serge is most. I'm making that in any case the main theme of the biography of Serge that I'm doing.
Can I just follow up on this about SDS and 68? Because you said there's a rediscovery of Serge, but what's interesting is, in fact, what SDS and 68, were like, maybe there was much less of the Marxist influence, and especially the kind of question that actually would have been key for classical anarchism, for Serge's, anarchism as well as Marxism, which was sort of the question of state power, right? And the question of whether there would be a state, right? SES, even as more radical, I guess there's the later split, and RIM and all this stuff. But to some degree, it seems like you were saying what was missing from SDS was, gender toleration and ability to critique some of the extremely internally oppressive functions of the organization.
Right.
But also it seems like that the revolutionary, reading Serge's Memoirs of a Revolutionary, the revolutionary moment of that period that was calling for the end of all states and the end of capitalism seems very different than the revolutionary moment of the 60s. So I was actually surprised when you said that was finding Serge once again.
Well, you've got to make some little distinctions here, okay? Thanks for coming. No, I understand your situation. They have to leave.
Thanks for coming, guys.
Thank you guys.
Actually, could you leave your email in case you would want to contribute anything?
Sure. So, all right. SDS starts out with the Port Huron Statement, which is a statement about participatory democracy. And it was in the spirit of the civil rights movement and so on. And gosh, I think that's very close to the Sergian spirit of some kind of movement from below, a social movement from below. But very quickly, when the anti-war part became crucial as the 60s grew on, most of the people accepted China and/or Vietnam as the model. China, the Maoist tyranny that was doing really horrible things, and Vietnam, which was much more united because they were fighting the imperialists. But of course, as everybody knows, Nixon hired Mao to fuck the Vietnamese. And no one would listen to me when I was telling them that in SDS. We were printing it in news and letters, but it was perfectly obvious. He cut off the supplies and China, and as soon as the Vietnamese got rid of the Americans, the Chinese attacked them along the border. Remember that?
Yeah.
And then they supported Cambodia against Vietnam.
Vietnam was they were the ones who actually, Vietnamese were the ones who put down Khmer Rouge.
Yes. But then Vietnam is still one of the most dictatorial countries in the world, and the average age of the Central Committee is 79. And of course, they're going full-fledged to capitalism, just like the Chinese, while maintaining the party bureaucracy in its total dominance. So that was the main influence, anti-imperialism, okay? Now, I think you have to be anti-imperialist, sure enough, but you have to be, one, against all imperialists, and number two, it's not enough to be anti-something. You've got to know what you're for. You're never going to win the revolution unless you put forward a vision of a better world and a way to get there, which is mass activity from below, and a better world, which is going to be based on cooperation and equality and democracy. It is impossible to have anything like socialism or equality without total freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, freedom to have trade unions, and so on. And this is exactly what Serge says in 1933 when he was arrested by the GPU, and he had smuggled out a statement that would be published in Paris in the case of his arrest, which came about 2 weeks later, because he spelled it coming, in which he said, if the workers don't have access to clear and good information about economics and politics and world things, how can they understand? How can they govern themselves? If the Soviets don't have the freedom to assemble, if workers can't strike and so on, there's nothing, you know. Plus, every kind of top-down thing is totally inefficient. I mean, through force and violence, Stalin industrialized Russia and succeeded to the extent that they were able to destroy the Nazi, state capitalist Nazi machine with the communist state capitalist machine. But what a sacrifice of nature and of humans.
Yeah, I wanted to maybe just pick up on one thing you said. You said about how it's not enough to just be anti-something. And I think that gets back to my earlier point about the kind of different problematic relationship between Marxism and anarchism today versus the problematic relationship between Marxism and anarchism that existed in Serge's time. After 91, you know, obviously the collapse of the Soviet Union, leftist parties around the world of the Stalinist parties more or less collapsed or retreated. Trotskyist parties tended to take a hit as well. The movements, anti-globalization, alter-globalization, that did emerge with a kind of amalgam of Marxist, but primarily anarchist, neo-anarchist activists, tended to do so under the rubric of a kind of anti-capitalism.
Right.
In a way that was a way, obviously, like, and then later the Marxists reemerged under the rubric of anti-war. I mean, they set up like the Answer Coalition, various soft fronts.
I wouldn't call those people Marxists, they're state socialists.
Well, fair enough.
Neo-Stalinists.
Well, yeah, I guess.
Maoists.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to ask though is like,
in their origin of the proletariat.
yeah. Well, I would just maybe want to ask, like, to what extent do you think that these various new forms under which the left is organized, anti-capitalism, without being for socialism or for syndicalism or for whatever, how much does that obscure actual deep rifts within the left by just having a sort of uniform opposition to capital or the state with various different emphases?
I see what you're saying. Well, first of all, I have a more sanguine view of the anti-globalization, capitalist globalization movement, because the slogan was another world is possible. And that's a big difference. The anti-war and the anti-imperialists all want to play politics with the Democrats or the Greens or some other thing and form some shitty coalition to try and stop the war within capitalism. Well, why not? That's why I called my book Beware of Capitalist Sharks. But the original title was Beware of Vegetarian Sharks, because they will pretend to be vegetarians. I try to deal with this in my book, which costs only $15. And there are 3 copies. Not only do I talk a lot about Victor Serge and about Russia, I also talk about our activities in Russia and how around Victor Serge, which is a wonderful rallying cry because the anarchists love him and the Marxists that you'd want to associate, wouldn't be ashamed to associate with, love him. That is to say, the good people that are still part of the what we call a post-Trotskyist movement love Serge.
I mean, well, I guess it would be different, like Bolsheviks, or like, I mean, he's a post-Trotskyist anarchist, or community.
Yeah, everybody loves Serge. And the point is, he's a wonderful sectarian repellent. It's like you spray something on that mosquitoes don't like. If you come up with Serge, the sectarians are not going to come in. The few times that they come into some of our meetings in Russia, we just ignored them and they went away. No one would rise to the bait of their slanders and their accusations and so on. We just went like this. Because the message here is that there's a long socialist tradition that goes back to the enragés in the French Revolution and Babeuf's conspiracy of equals and Owen's, attempts to build little utopias with the huge fortune that he had, and Fourier's wonderful ideas and so on, and all of these traditions flow together, and we can pick out of them those that didn't betray, those that didn't join bourgeois governments and send workers off to kill each other, that didn't set up totalitarian states. So that's our tradition, and Serge incarnates it, and he tells us more about it than anyone else. He synthesizes it. So, it seems to me Serge is, if we didn't have Platypus, we could have Serge. And it really worked so well in Russia. Well, Platypus is good because you won't have a bunch of assholes that take themselves too seriously. I hope. Or some do.
I have a question. Earlier you talked about how you said you were referring to Serge, and then you were talking about where revolution needs to brew, and you said it needs to brew from below. I mean, that's a very common phrase that's hard to disagree with necessarily, but I'm wondering, there's various conceptions in which people that bring people to power, or working class to power. Council Communists thinks it's through
Yes.
workers' councils.
Yes.
Then there's the Vanguard Party formed.
Right.
So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little further on what you meant by conjuring up power from below, because there's various political manifestations that could take.
Well, I have a chapter in here called Horizontals and Verticals, where I try to balance the pros and cons on all of that. Certainly, I'm very sympathetic to the Council Communists, as Serge was in their time, and to Rosa Luxemburg, whom I consider a very important figure. What is it precisely you want me to?
I was just wondering what kind. I mean, I guess maybe we could try to talk about it via Serge too, because he obviously hovered with many different groups and many different kinds of political conceptions of how the working class or the people in general could rise to power of the state, achieve a revolution. But my question is, how did Serge imagine gaining power politically? Did he? I mean, at times he seems sympathetic to the Leninist model, but other times he seems sympathetic to other models, from what I'm gathering from the presentation. And then my other question would be how would you, since the left is relatively has almost no power compared to Serge's time, how would you imagine the left to rebuild itself today, based on Serge's perspective?
First of all, Serge dealt with concrete situations.
Mm-hmm.
The Bolsheviks were in power. They tried to share power, but no one would share power with them except the left SRs, and then they started shooting at them because they were terrorists. So that wasn't exactly a fair way to debate, it seems to me. And then there was the Civil War, you see, with 14 league capitalist countries against the Soviet Republic. So Serge had to choose sides. Now, when you talk about the left, first of all, I don't like the phrase the left, because the left is a phrase that we get from parliamentarism. It starts with the French Revolution, and where the delegates happen to sit in a certain room with the Bolsheviks on one side, the Jacobins on the one side, the Syrians on the other, and the Slavs. Right, because of course there's a strong influence there.
Yes.
I think Daniel Guérin is an interesting figure who attacks Bolshevik Jacobinism and who is transitional between Marxism and anarchism.
Trotsky called Lenin early on Maximilian Lenin. And of course later he seemed to view the Jacobinism of the Bolsheviks as a more positive thing. And even viewed like himself as a member of that rather than the Bonaparte that emerged from the Jacobins or the Bolsheviks.
Well, of course, what Lenin said to him, what he's quoted by Serge as saying at the time of Kronstadt is, we will make Thermidor ourselves. Now, Thermidor is when the reactionary elements took over and stopped the revolution. And the chopped off the heads of Robespierre and the rest of them. So when Lenin said, we will make Thermidor ourselves, that is something to really think about, because it combines what Thermidor opened the gate to Bonapartism. And Lenin's banning of factions in the party and his crushing of free discussion in Russia opened the door to Stalinism. In fact, he threw out Preobrajensky as party secretary and put in Stalin, because Stalin he could control, and Preobrajensky argued. And that's what happened. Now, Lenin lived to regret it. His last fight was against Stalin. And some people think poisoned him, what do I know? He was sick, but he was sick because he had a brainwave when he realized that what he had created in Russia was not what he wanted, and that they had to fight against what he called commune lies. That's a phrase of Lenin's.
I mean, can I just make maybe a finer point about this point of Chris's about taking power in Serge? Because it seems to me that, the context, one of the things that I found so, different, obviously, from reading the memoirs, is that Serge is dealing with a context of a broad revolutionary movement, large-scale workers' uprisings. So, neither Serge nor the Bolsheviks, in fact, nobody could say that like the Bolsheviks or something caused the Russian Revolution or were the Russian Revolution,
Right.
in fact. The issue, what Serge thought, was that the Bolsheviks were more ably organized than a lot of the anarchists to be able to, preserve the revolution from the vast counter-revolutionary forces which were immediately coming against it. But I do think that it's important that any, both Serge's critical support of the Bolsheviks onto the most hardline Bolsheviks of the early Russian Revolution, like the Bolsheviks saw themselves as in relationship to the broad revolutionary movement in a sort of critical relationship, fulfilling certain tasks, and that I think for me, in a way, that's the most alien thing in a way about Serge's book, is that the kind of the broad revolutionary background. There's like Bolsheviks and pseudo-Bolsheviks around. There are still anarchists I know, et cetera. But the sort of the sense of the revolutionary times that you get in Serge.
Well, remember that Serge didn't get to Russia until the Civil War, because the French locked him up in a concentration camp, so he couldn't get there in 1917, when they were still open, and when the Soviets were still active, and there were workers' committees and so on and so forth. So the line was already drawn between basically two statist military terrors. The white terror and the red terror, that's all there was. And he had to join the red side. But as an historian, he wrote Year One of the Russian Revolution and various other works where he talks about the spontaneity of the masses and so on. Now, I've tried to answer your question, and it took me a whole book, okay? Which could be subtitled The Invisible International. In fact, my utopian part, I'm going to reissue as The Invisible International. It was written before Occupy, before Egypt, before the events of 2011. But I've been saying since 1997 that the internet provides us with a platform on which the, Archimedes' wonderful metaphor, give me a lever long enough, a platform to stand on, a fulcrum, and I will lift the world. Well, clearly the world is going to hell in a handcart. Capitalism is destroying the world, and we only have one generation if we have that. The lever we've all known about, it's solidarity. It's the same lever that Spartacus and the slaves discovered, that the communards discovered. The problem, and that the internationalists, and by the way, Marx was never in the majority in the Working People's International that they got him to be secretary of. He didn't have a vote in it either, since you had to be a worker to vote. But the whole idea of working people of all nations unite is clear. And it comes through in the Wobblies, which was, again, formed by a coalition of anarchists, syndicalists, and Marxists. Debs was there, and so was Bill Haywood, and the rest of them, okay? And what we're talking about is what Rosa Luxemburg most eloquently described in the 1905 general strikes that spread all across the Russian Empire, from Poland to the Far East, which is self-organization. Self-organization. And Rosa pointed out that strikes were more likely to be successful when organized spontaneously by workers than when directed by trade unions, Mensheviks, or Bolsheviks. The reason being that the workers' instincts, their informal ways of communicating with each other, let them know when the mood was right. When if you called for a strike, people would come out. Whereas the intellectuals and the vanguards that from their university-educated brains try to direct people without the hands-on experience of living in the life of their communities, often are misleaders, even with the very best of intentions. So I'm certainly for horizontalism and movements from below and counter-communism and assemblies and things like that. And what my vision is that we now have a place to stand where men and women are equal on the internet, and Chinese and Americans are equal on the internet. And by the way, if you want to know where the class struggle is happening, look at China. Massive strikes in China.
You're going to see on the internet.
What?
A struggle on the internet.
Well, yeah, but the Chinese don't know what to do with the internet because they can't shut it down, and at the same time, it's the way that information gets out and gets around. So you have whole municipalities rising up in China against privatization and against pollution and so on. Everybody's been telling me forever and ever that there's no more proletariat. And I say, who made that you're wearing? Who made the car you drive? It's all made in Asia or in Latin America. Runaway factories it starts in England in the 19th century. So capitalism has always gone everywhere to find cheap labor and to open up markets, but now it's reached its limit. China was the prize for the imperialists all through the 19th and 20th century. Now China is the kick-ass rival of the United States and its creditor. And if the United States didn't have more bombs and tanks, believe me, the power of China would be even stronger. But the one thing that the Chinese leaders are afraid of with their corruption. By the way, the Chinese leaders, you know, the CEOs in America average 380 times as much as the average workers in America. Did you know that?
Mhm.
In China, it's 1,700 times. Okay? The party members and the leaders of industry in China. So what you're seeing is huge class divisions happening all over the world. And the internet providing a way for all of us to communicate and to all of us to have information which we're not going to necessarily get from the media. And there's no reason why next Thursday a global flash mob can't overthrow capitalism.
Let's-
Two short questions on imperialism. Well, we already addressed anti-imperialism, but how do you think the understanding of imperialism changed from around Serge's time or before Stanislavski, from then to the new line? And then the second question is, did you meet Peter Sedgwick?
Oh, yes.
What was he like?
He was a little, kind of scruffy guy from not upper class who was a scholarship boy who went to Oxford. And very, very British. Funny as hell. Just go to Peter Sedgwick's website and we put together a lot of his writings. He's absolutely marvelous. Now, imperialism in Serge's time. All right, let's go forward. Okay. Lenin's imperialism, which dates from 1916 and coincides with the Irish uprising of Easter. Lenin saw that the weakest link in the capitalist chain were these enslaved nations, right? And that the bacillus of revolution, instead of coming necessarily from the most advanced country, the spark might come from Ireland. And he saw, as Marx had seen much earlier, because Marx was a great supporter of the Irish, that there's no way that the British with their trade unions were going to get anywhere as long as the Irish were enslaved. Just like he said to the Americans, white labor will never be free as long as labor in the black skin is branded. Because you can have internal, you know, the first imperialisms were blacks here and Irishmen in England, okay? So that finally, what happens with imperialism is that it creates a privileged class of workers who live off of the super profits. Even if you're a poor white in the South, you still can look down on a black, and that's still true today. So that's the relationship. But imperialism is not a thing in itself. It's not a policy. The U.S. can no longer stop being imperialism, then a shark can become a vegetarian. It's not a policy, it is the nature of the beast. The capitalism is a world system. It will go everywhere to suck cheapest labor, crash open markets and destroy democracy and sovereignty and everything else. So basically, I think when you said anti-capitalism, you said it all. Now, Rosa Luxemburg studied imperialism, and she saw how it kept capitalism going, because they always found a new frontier, new ways to pile up super profits, which they could then distribute among the hard hat, high paid, unionized working class, buy off the union leaders, you know, turn them into an American firsters and so on. And it's no different in the communist unions in France. I've written a lot about that, which you can read. So, you know, that privileged working class in the more advanced countries is basically participating through buying cheap goods from China. You know, there's 11 cents of labor in, you know, a suit that you buy in the country here, you know, where they charge you $50 at the Banana Republic or something. So that's the nature of imperialism, and it's very corrupting. But the only way that it can be really overcome is by overcoming capitalism as a world system. And although the spark may come from Latin America, just as it came from Egypt before it got to Wisconsin, until we all get together, we're going to fall backwards, because every national revolution is going to become reactionary until the Arabs unite, and you also unite with the workers of other countries. They're going to get, as a result of their wonderful democratic revolutions, Islamists. Just another form of capitalism. And believe me, they are heavy-duty capitalists. What's going on in Egypt now, the Saudi Arabians are buying everything. And they're privatizing everything in Egypt. So it's capitalism. That's what it's about. And what I love about the Another World is Possible movement is that we all have t-shirts that say, we are not commodities to be bought and sold. I am not a commodity to be bought and sold. The essence of Marxism is that human beings cannot be bought and sold. That the selling of labor power, as if it was the same as a commodity that's finished, is fundamentally alienating, fundamentally anti-human. And that it's not a question of replacing the market by state planning, because we've seen that both of them produce starvation and ecological destruction and super exploitation of labor. It's a question of people getting together through cooperative labor. So, you know, a long time ago I was in France, and I was part of a group called Socialism or Barbarism, and one of our best intellectuals was Castoriadis, and we knew as Barjot, which is a funny name, and he wrote something called The Content of Socialism, which is the closest to a utopia of a practical nature than I've ever seen. Now, this was in the 50s, but he was in touch with Norbert Wiener, and he knew something about cybernetics. And he pointed out how, through democratic discussion and so on, there could be what he called, I don't like the phrase, planning factories, where experts make available to workers all over all the things about production and so on, so that we could have intelligent debates about, are we going to have an 8-hour day and move very slowly towards more commodities being produced, a 4-hour day and just enjoy ourselves? You know, all the major questions of what to produce, how to produce it, under what conditions, and so on, could be discussed intelligently if different positions were put forward based on experts who would just be experts. They wouldn't be for one side or another. And we could have internet votes on every question in the world on a planetary scale. There's no reason why any of this can't happen, and that it can't happen next Thursday.
Except us. We might be standing in the way.
Why do you think people have forgotten this point about cybernetics? It seems nobody talks about it now on the left.
I do.
I don't know, just an idea.
I do.
General,
and there's a whole bunch of people. There's a whole hackers revolution.
Right, but they're not so much, I mean, it's very sort of anarcho-individualist, or anarcho-capitalist even. It's not very connected to the left tradition. Like, I know for a fact that, at least in the Soviet Union, cybernetics, they were aware of it, they just didn't utilize it, didn't go for it, basically.
Well, they didn't, because in a totalitarian system, you can't let people, even scientists in lab, have the internet. That's one of the reasons that the system broke down, and that Gorbachev was able to put through glasnost, which means transparency, because they can't compete unless they have cybernetics. By the way, the inventor of systems analysis was Bogdanov, the eccentric old Bolshevik from 1905 who wrote that marvelous science fiction about Mars, where socialists take over Mars and everything is beautiful, except at the end of the book you find out that they've used up all the resources and that they're going to invade the Earth and turn the Earth into a new place to grind up. And their only debate is whether humans are educatable or whether they should be wiped out. So a good old Bogdanov knew a whole lot. And Vernadsky, you may know something about him, who invented the ecosphere. Okay, I'm writing on that too, on ecology, because basically I kind of put ecology together with my views. All of this is available for $15. It's a bargain.
I wonder if someone who hasn't spoken yet, we have a few people. So, Brian, is there something on your mind?
Not at present.
Eric?
RNYRP.
I mean, I most of what I was going to say has kind of come up. I was kind of curious about a kind of Occupy Wall Street in a way. I only went out a couple of times and wasn't very involved, because I figured there probably were people here who were more involved. Because there's a strange thing. I was reading this book not in the height of Occupy Wall Street, but you know, during Occupy Wall Street, and we've talked about it already. So I'm kind of bringing up old stuff. But you know, Serge is going, as we've been talking about, he goes with Soviets, and he says they're not perfect, but you know, this is the side I want to be on. I realize there's lots of problems here, but this is the side I want to be on. Where sometimes, and again, I'm much of an outsider and I'm reading mainstream media, so I could be wrong. You know, one of the problems with Wall Street in a way was it's like, oh, well, that could be corrupt, that's kind of corruptible, 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 and then there's no space at all. Well, Serge, I feel like, says we've got to fight corruption, but we still have to go for this, even if it is a little bit corrupted. And I don't know whether, and I kind of thought maybe, you know, I kind of was, when I was reading Memoirs of a Revolutionary, I was like, everybody in Occupy Wall Street should read this book.
Certainly,
But
that's
I took
why
it
I came back. But they took, the cops hauled away the, I was going to give a whole
We
bunch of
donated books
copies
to the library, Richard,
to the
don't worry.
library
We
down
did.
there. But,
We did, we brought them down.
oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
Good.
They probably were thrown out, but, I mean, and I could be wrong, I don't think of myself as
Well,
an expert on
all right,
this, so-
I think, you know, I think that Occupy Wall Street and Occupy everything is exactly the way to fly. And I thought they were perfectly correct, having been through SDS and many other things, to absolutely refuse to make demands. Because if you make demands, you recognize that these people are the boss and they're running the worlds, and they're going to give you some crumbs at the table if you behave. But that's not what we want. I remember the wonderful 68 poster in France, where there's some government guy up on a platform, and he keeps saying, well, what do you want? And then you see the masses down below and lots of little voices saying, we want a revolution, right? And he can't hear them. He can't hear them now. All of that has got to be swept away. What are you going to do? Have fracking, but maybe not tar sands? I mean, we don't have time to mess around with those things. It's all or nothing, baby. And it's now that it's happening. So unless it's massive and spontaneous and gets around this supported, because you see, anti-imperialism is a lie. It's always pro somebody else's imperialism. It's not an accident that what some of us are forced by habit to call the left supported Gaddafi. Now, I didn't support U.S. intervention, but we had what's his name, Chavez, was supporting Gaddafi, and the Ayatollahs.
And Assad.
Mm-hmm. So don't they get it after all of these years that there are global imperialists, regional imperialists, new imperialists, and old imperialists, and that they fight among each other? Now, I went to historical materialism, and I satirize it in here, where they were having a wonderful thing 5 years ago, saying that capitalism really was always able to overcome its contradictions and reinvent itself and so on, and that the conflicts between, and somebody said a word about World War II. And the answer was it was just a dust-up. And of course there were some people there that had survived it, that were ready to lynch the speaker. But this was the basic line of academic Marxism.
Yeah, and this is David Harvey's stuff, right?
I don't remember him being particularly there, but
This is where it's coming
my report on that was called Alice in Imperialist Wonderland.
Let me make a thing about Occupy though. I mean, on the one hand, right, yes, there's the no demands, but on the other hand, at least arguably, I think part of the reason Occupy fell apart was it was unable to form any coherent opposition to Obama, right? That like, you know, I mean, so winter came, right, and the police, there were practical reasons why Occupy died. But part of the reason I think it didn't come back in the spring, as many of us kind of thought it might, was in fact because, you know, the sort of idea of coming up with some sort of alternative to the Democrats or of discussing what it would mean to take power or anything like this was not really in the cards in Occupy.
Well, I'll say two things about that. One is, it did come back. We had Occupy Sandy. over in Coney Island in Rockaway, when FEMA showed up 15 days later, when the Board of Health was out, when no one was there, Occupy Sandy people were there. They, within 24 hours, they set up a clinic. They were the only people that walked up the 15 flights of those, towers where they park, people like me on Social Security that need their diabetic medicine and so on. There was nobody there from the Army or anybody else but Occupy Sandy. And they went there out of the goodness of their hearts, but also to organize. And that's the only way that it can ever happen. Put not your faith in princes or in governments. Anti-Obama, what would that be? Well, we've got the Green Party. It has zero prospects in a system, political system that's totally broken down, where money just totally controls elections, and with the media, they kept the third party out of the debates and out of the media. That's not the... Occupy changed the conversation famously in the United States. And when we said, this is what democracy looks like, that resonated with a lot of people. And it's going to have to be something like that on a global scale. We're going to have to occupy more than a little park where the cops can come in and, that's the whole big problem is that I'm a veteran of the civil rights movement, but it seems to me that Bloomberg's cops are worse than Sheriff Clark. What?
Cousin. The sheriff, you said sheriff, I thought of
Sheriff Clark.
Buford Busser or Clark.
Or Axe Handle Maddox, or any of those Southerners, some of whom sort of reformed and learned to deal like old politicos with a few blocks in office and so on. So, no, we have to be able to be out in such force, that they can't pull that bullshit on us. And, I think that the only way to organize is through nonviolence. And they have a monopoly of vast means of collective destruction. The police now look like cockroaches with all of their equipment and so on. And the only way that we're ever going to win is by winning over the troops, by talking to them, like they did in Portugal and many and every other revolution. Russia, where Trotsky famously pointed out how the revolution took place by diving under the bellies of Cossack horses. Because the Cossacks stood there They wouldn't saber them, but they wouldn't join them either. But that was enough. So neutral, you know, the enemies are going to have to realize that they're going to have to kill us all. They're going to anyway. They're depriving us of air and water. And I mean, the catastrophe that's clearly visible. You haven't heard of Greeman's law. Greeman's law is that every time there's an official report by the UN or any other thing on climate thing, that the curve is worse and worse and worse. That the worst position, maximum of the worst that could happen, becomes the baseline 2 years later. I mean, who would have thought that the whole polar ice cap would be gone by now? So
They said 2 degrees 2 years ago, and it's now 4 degrees, is what they said.
So, what to do about Obama? Obama.
Does anyone have a maybe closing question, or we could reconvene over drinks or something? But
That
otherwise,
sounds nice.
Yeah, let's go when you're ready.
But I don't have enough money unless you buy the book.
Okay, well, thank you, Richard, and thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you to the NRB for co-sponsoring. And we'll have summer reading group, which Chris I don't think mentioned, TBA, and
Ooh.
things going on.
Well, I'll be in France. I'll be back in September, and I would love you to join the Serge reading group.
Yeah, I think I have the flyers.